You're listening to Word of Mouth from BBC Radio 4. Recently we went to America to see my relatives. This involved our children meeting up with children who are the grandchildren of my father's cousin. Now, we spent a good deal of time talking about how we were all related and what we should all call each other. In and amongst that, we had to talk about the fact that my father's cousin married twice, having a child from his first marriage, see if I can get this right, a child from his second marriage, and 2 stepchildren who were the children of his second wife. As this part of the family tree spread out, we found that there were more and more half and step, siblings and cousins. In Yiddish, the first language of some of these folks, there's a general word meaning the relatives. It's the mishpucha, often said with a kind of wave of the hand, gesturing out there somewhere where they all live, or perhaps ought to live. In one sense, none of this is new. It wasn't only Henry VIII who had children in different marriages and indeed non-marriages. Perhaps what's new is that more and more ordinary people, not just aristocrats, are in these situations and trying to find the words for them. And what is a family anyway? Well, with me in the studio is Dr. Laura Wright, reader in English language at the University of Cambridge. And on the line from New York City, we're joined by the social researcher Dr. Wednesday Martin. Wednesday, can you tell us about your own family and what names came to mean to you?
Happily. I married my husband in 2000, and he had 2 daughters from his previous marriage. The girls were 11 and 14 at the time. Fast forward to today, and my husband and I have 2 boys, 7 and 13. But at the time that I married my husband, I found having 2 teenage stepdaughters exciting and interesting and very, very challenging indeed, and so much more complicated than I had ever imagined.
And Wednesday, you wrote a book called Step Monster, a new look at why real stepmothers think, feel and act the way we do. And I wanted to ask you, why did you choose this emotive construction, step monster?
I think the best way to sort of deconstruct or dismantle a very taboo social reality is to start with the language. And so when I used the term step monster for the title of my book, I was trying very consciously to put an uncomfortable cultural truth that we like to avoid front and center. And that uncomfortable truth is we really as a culture love to dislike stepmothers. And being a stepmother myself and having had some, notably sort of unmaternal feelings sometimes toward my stepchildren, I really wanted to see what toll does it take on kids and partners and women that we love to dislike stepmothers so much. I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and that's why I used that word stepmonster.
My dad's second wife sometimes introduces me or introduces herself, I should say, as Michael's wicked stepmother. She makes a kind of gag out of it, if you like. Do you think there's a problem with the word stepmother itself? Is that problematic for you?
A lot of people think that the issue in the nomenclature of stepfamilies is the term step. And as an anthropologist, I tend more to believe that the issue is with the term family, or in stepmother, the word mother, or in stepfather, the word father. These kids of any age, Michael, whether they're 55 or 70 or 5, already have parents, whether they're living or dead, and the step-parent is a different kind of adult in their life. So I have to really admire your stepmother for getting out in front of it and making a joke and really underscoring that you are not her son and being honest about it. I think good relationships start with honest nomenclature.
You think it's the core word, if you like, the biological word, the mother, father, son and daughter bit attached to the step that is the problem. In an ideal world would have a step male or step female or something. I know that's very crude, but something like that. Is that what you think?
Hopefully your listeners will have lots of ideas, but I do think that the problem is when we overlay the expectation that stepfamilies should or must be and act and feel like first families, that stepmothers should act and feel like their mothers, that stepchildren should feel as if they're someone's child. They're not, and it's fine to acknowledge that with the language. And when we do, we really make it more comfortable for people to have less sort of hypocritical, culturally loaded, socially determined relationships and more honest, straightforward ones. Because the honest, straightforward truth is that step relations are complicated. They're not just like first family relationships, which themselves can be complicated. We know that step families are different from first families, not better, not worse, just different. And it's nice to acknowledge that, I think, with the language, rather than just gloss it over.
The prefix step originally referred to relationships that came about because one parent had died and then the other one had remarried, which is...
like in the folk stories, like in Snow White.
Yes, exactly. And it's quite often not how we use it today, because nowadays divorce is so prevalent. But historically, a stepmother was one who becomes a mother to an orphan, and that concept of orphanage has only relatively recently ceased to be an essential part of the meaning. I was looking at the 1881 census. I was looking at my own family, and it turns out that my great-grandfather was widowed at the age of 33 with 6 small children.
6.
So in those circumstances, I mean, this is Victorian England, there's no welfare state. A stepmother was a necessity. It wasn't a luxury, it was something he absolutely had to do. I mean, Wednesday, do you have any suggestions? What would you rather hear than stepmother?
I don't have cut and dried or prescriptive suggestions. My biggest suggestion is that we just kick to the curb terms like blended family or bonus mother or heart mother or all of these things which really give a clue more to a deep cultural fantasy and a romantic attachment to first families, which, as Laura points out, there have been very big historic and demographic shifts which have changed up the composition of families and changed up the relationships. So while I can't, suggest a term, personally I like the term step family, although I know it's very loaded for people. I think that it's one of the best of a number of options because it's honest and it's straightforward.
Wednesday, can I ask you, what do you call yourself? Do you call yourself a stepmother?
Yes, I do. And I decided that what was comfortable for me was to refer to myself as their stepmother. And I had a terrible, terrible misstep one day in which I described my teenage stepdaughter as my daughter. And it was so awkward for everyone. My interlocutor thought, what, did she suddenly have a baby that I didn't know about? And my stepdaughter, no doubt, felt mortified that I had sort of stepped on her mother's territory, which is a bad move for me to have made. And I felt very hypocritical and disingenuous. I was supposed to feel like she was my daughter, I thought, so wasn't I supposed to call her my daughter?
Yeah.
And after a lot of research, I figured out that it's really better in every way to bring some honesty and candor to the picture rather than to operate under the assumption that you should feel a certain way. You should feel maternal.
Yes.
They should feel like your children.
What do your stepdaughters call you?
They call me by my first name. What stepchildren want to call their step-parents will really hinge on where they are developmentally, how old they are, how close are they to the divorced or deceased parent, how strong is that bond, what do they feel comfortable with. Right away it was clear that my stepdaughters, being teenage girls, wanted to call me Wednesday, and that worked very well for everyone.
Back with that term blended family, I actually first heard that in the States. Someone wanted to describe my family as a blended family, and I hadn't heard it before, and I remember just sort of playing with it in my mouth for a while. I know about blended coffee, and I thought, is it the same as blended coffee?
You may know that I absolutely loathe the term blended family, and I can't tell you how many people come to me in workshops and tell me that they actually feel, damaged and inferior when they hear the term blended family because it's not what's happening on the ground for real step families.
So do you say to people, do you, as it were, ban them and say, don't use the word blended? Is that how strong you feel about it?
Now I'm sounding wicked. I'm sounding terribly
the wicked
wicked.
Stepmother, yeah.
Do you know what I like? I just like to give people the facts. And the fact is that step families aren't first families. And very quickly, here's why. There's been a divorce or a death. There are 2 or more households, and children of all ages experience loyalty binds when there's been a divorce or death in a repartnership. So I do agree with the National Step Family Resource Center, which has called for the media and mental health professionals to stop using the term blended because it makes families feel like they're failing. But, on the ground, people will use the language that feels good to them. You just hope that they understand that if they use the term blended, they are setting up some rather unrealistic expectations, and they might be making their very own family members feel sad or somehow that they're not measuring up.
Yes. How do you feel about network
Well,
family?
I think that network family is interesting. It's terribly unsentimental and unromantic sounding, but I think that it really sort of can accurately describe these demographic units on the ground in a way that blended absolutely cannot.
Can I give you some phrases that sort of accrue around the notion of second families? Because I think you're going to find quite a few of these negative. What about failed marriage, for example?
Hate it. whether you like it or dislike it, divorce historically is a reality, and families, adults will repartner, and different networks and families will be formed. And to call it a failed marriage really is to fail to understand, the social and historic reality around us. So I personally, I don't like the term failed marriage.
What about broken family? Even worse?
It just really couldn't be more negative and couldn't make people feel worse. And in a funny way, Laura, I think that it goes hand in hand with the term blended family. Blended family, this term just speaks to this deep cultural fantasy that if we're upbeat and positive enough, we can turn step families into first families, and that should be the measure of success. It'll be interesting to see people all over the world, as demographics of families change, try to invent a language that rings true to their actual experience.
Yeah. Let's go to the parents. What about bio-dad?
Well, I like that. Bio-dad.
It sounds like washing powder.
It's like he's a sperm donor or
Yeah.
something. Right? I see
Well,
what
he
happens.
was.
Yes, he was.
And a bit more sometimes,
but
Laura.
it's as if he were only a sperm donor when we call him bio-dad. And I've heard very well-meaning step-parents use this term because they want to get out there that they themselves are important in the lives of these children or adult children. I just don't think that claiming to be another parent is the way to do that, or reducing the parent to the term bio mom or bio dad. They're simply the mom
reductive,
and the dad.
Yeah.
To me.
And Wednesday, you used a term I haven't heard, which is heart mother.
Good Lord. Yes. It's a term that's very popular on the internet. It is a euphemism for stepmother, and it certainly gives clue to the fact that we are uncomfortable with the cultural and social and linguistic connotations of the word stepmother, and I think that it is sort of a reaction formation in the other direction. And
It sounds
is
a bit like pre-loved furniture. You know, when I go to America, I love that.
Yeah.
It says what we call second-hand
car,
Wednesday. It says pre-loved, and I always think you could be.
We're very big on euphemisms and being upbeat in my country, and I think that heart mother is one of them, and bonus mother is one of them. And I have to say, honestly, the children and adult children that I work with who have step-parents will often say to me, "I love this woman, but I just don't like the idea of the term mom being involved because I have a mom. My mom is dead, or my mom lives in California or London, but I have a mom." So again, I think that heart mom, bonus mom, all these things, I get where people are coming from, but I just want them to see how potentially destructive it is to their own overarching goal of closeness to superimpose this complexity.
So who comes up with these terms? Does somebody sit in some kind of non-governmental organisation and go, "Hey, let's have, a pre-loved mom," or something? Who? I mean, in your experience, are there people out there who sit there with a pencil and paper and come up with them?
I think what I see is that because the demographic realities of family units are changing so quickly, people are trying to come up with terms, and instead of it being imposed from the top down by researchers who are often way behind the way the rest of us are living or closely behind, what's happening is these terms are a bottom-up phenomenon, and it's sort of like a wildfire of people trying to come up with language that works for them and other people.
And families are little, how can I put it, little hothouses. I mean, every family's got its own little nicknames for each other. I must say, within my family, I almost never use people's given names because we have all sorts of crazy names for each other. My granddad's name for my grandma was "Are You There?" He never used her name. Her name was Minnie. He never called her Minnie.
Children will go through that phase that, in America at least, in which they call their parents by their first names. I think.
That's my situation.
Michael.
Yes, I did that.
Yeah,
Did
but
you do that
Michael
with
did
your
it for a
parents?
very specific reason.
Yes, I think my parents, coming from a sort of left-wing tradition, thought that somehow or other mum and dad were diminutives, that it diminished them in the world. So right from the day we were born, we called our parents Connie and Harold. At some point or another, I rebelled against my rebel parents and called my mum, but never got round to calling my dad, though I did come up with a few others, like Fav. And I even, for a while when I did Latin, called him Pater, just to take the mickey out of him.
And did he like it?
He loved it. He loved Pater. He thought the
Your
idea...
communist father loved Peter.
He loved the fact that I had this Latin word for him, but there you go. So when it comes to the matter of siblings, obviously parents have control over children's language when they're 2, 3 and 4. Is your view that children should be told what to call their full siblings, half siblings and step siblings, or just sort of let them get on with it and let it emerge?
My situation's very typical in that there's a large gap between the ages of my stepchildren and my children.
Yeah.
And I'm always very honest with my children that they and their sisters, as they like to call them, have the same dad, but they have different moms. And that confused them initially, but they just sort of slipped right into it. I do not call the stepdaughters, I do not refer to my stepdaughters, whom I love very much, and they're interesting, bright, wonderful girls. I do not call them your sisters. I say your half-sisters.
Oh.
And my sons call them their sisters, and sometimes when they haven't seen them for a long time, because the girls are much older and fledged and have their own lives, they'll refer to them as their half-sisters. Then when the girls are around, they slip back into the nomenclature without the term half, and they use the term my sister. I would never tell a kid you have to call a half-sibling a sibling. Do you know why? It's not true. It might be unsavory to us. We might wish it, but that doesn't mean that we should impose the language on our children or our adult children. Let's see where they are in that relationship and what language speaks honestly to their experience of the relationship.
Yes, that's quite interesting, because the half prefix stuck on the front of words has in some situations been a bit pejorative. So there's a famous kind of bad phrase, half-caste, which is by and large being banned in this country. It was the suggestion that somehow or other or some people say I'm half this. So what about
Right.
the other half? You end up with a kind of idea that you're just walking around as a half a person, and so it's pretty well been banned. I mean, that term half-caste has been replaced by mixed heritage, mixed background, that sort of thing. But in a way, you want to sort of defend the half on the grounds that it's imposing something it's like trying to push this blended family thing by saying
right.
they are your brothers and sisters.
I'd like to just defend again the reality that step families can be wonderful without being or feeling like or being held to the standard of first families. I'd love to know what Laura thinks about the term half.
The half denotes the relationship, as you say, the biological reality. But we're very capable of holding, how can I put it, almost antithetical meanings within one word. I mean, let me give you the verb to cleave. You can cleave to somebody or you can cleave asunder, cleave something, you know, and I mean, there's a complete antithesis there. So half doesn't have to mean not whole. You don't have to trigger that response, or alternatively, you can do. Surely it's all about the attitude.
Yes.
If you get along with your half-siblings, then there's no problem. If you don't get along with your half-siblings, then it could perhaps exacerbate.
You're just a half.
Yeah.
You could use it as a weapon, couldn't you? Children do know how to do
I
that,
think,
after all.
Yeah.
And what about the word family itself? Because in a way, it's actually very kind of blurry and imprecise, isn't it? Because it can mean just 2 generations, a pair and their children, but then it can mean a whole family tree, going back through several or even many generations. It can spread sideways, and we can include our cousins and second cousins. They're all family, we might say. And then it can include the halves and the steps that we're talking about today.
Well, half of the words we use for our family members are English, but half of them are French. And there's quite an interesting distribution. You won't be at all surprised to hear that the words for our closest family relatives are directly from Old English. So mother comes from Old English modor, father comes from Old English fader, brother from Old English brodor, sister was swester in Old English, daughter was dochter, son was sunu. so much we might expect. But our next closest relatives are aunts, uncles, cousins, niece, nephew, grandparents. They're not of Old English etymology. They descend from Anglo-Norman French. And they pushed aside, as it were, our perfectly good Old English words for the job. We had a full set originally before the Norman Conquest.
What was
it's just that, well, we stopped using them. So an aunt was either a modricha, which is your maternal aunt, or she was a fadu, which is your paternal aunt. Your maternal uncle was your am, and your paternal uncle was your fadera.
So we've actually lost a distinction there.
We've lost that distinction. And then your grandmother was your Yeldra moder and your grandfather was your Yelder father. So today we would call them an elder mother and an elder father. I mean, it sounds perfectly transparent, doesn't it? But we set them aside and we took over, for example, uncle, which came to French from Latin. The avunculus originally meant your mother's brother.
Was that nuncle for a while?
Ah, yes, where we missplit up the article beforehand, absolutely. And aunt is rather a lovely one because aunt is used in so many situations other than your mother or father's sister. It can be a lady who looks after you or a well-wisher from the family. In India, it tends to be an honorary title just for any lady over a certain
I think
age.
in the Caribbean, a woman who looks after you is sometimes called a tanti in some of the Caribbean islands.
So a French aunt.
Yes, in a way.
Yeah, and that comes from Latin amita, which is the verb from the verb amare, to love. So it's like a loving lady, as it were.
And do you know, if I could just interject for 1 second there, Laura, it's interesting that a lot of the experts I really respect suggest that women with stepchildren think of it as more of an auntie relationship. That term is not so loaded, and it really helps people rethink how to have these relationships.
Well, there would have been, at different times, in different places, plenty of families who had one side of the family that was French and one side of the family that was English. I mean, if you imagine...
Competing terms.
Well, if you think
same
about
people.
the Norman Conquest, 1066, okay, so we have our French dynasty bringing French to Britain. Over the generations, we are going to have interbreeding, aren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very small amount of Norman French people compared to an enormous amount of Old English-speaking people. So as time goes by and relationships form, you're potentially going to have dad who's French-speaking and mum who's English-speaking. And so we're still acting as though we're coming from split families, in a way, at least split culturally.
And let's do mother. I mean, the terms that people use, I mean, if you think about it, we've got mum and mummy, and with Wednesday there, it's more like mom in America. My dad always called his mother Ma, but then that might have been from the time that they lived in America. I don't know. And then there's some people, Mama, maybe still called it, I don't know, and Mama.
My dad called his mum Mrs. Wright.
Oh, right.
As an intimacy marker, you know?
Yeah.
Because you think of it as formal, but actually he was being... It's more intimate in a way than mum.
Yeah.
But, when he was saying goodbye, he would always say, Chippa, Chima. So clearly there was an underlying ma there and a pa there. But I remember him calling her Mrs. Wright. My aunts called her mother-in-law mum. And that's very common, isn't it, in Britain, to call your mother-in-law mum?
So people seem to want diminutives for the mother figure, is that right? So that by and
it
large...
has a wider application than mother, is my point. That it can refer to your mother, but it can also refer to your mother-in-law. My next-door neighbour calls his wife mum, because, I mean, that's her role within the family. She's the mum, and he refers to her as mum. Even though they've been married for, well, they're in their 80s now, so they've probably been married for sort of 50 years or something, and she's been mum to him for all of that time. But
and then what about the next generation up, the grandmothers? What have you got for us there?
Well, let me just speak about my own family there, because I lived together with my grandparents and my cousins. So in my household, we had Nan was my great-grandma. Then on my mother's side, it was Nanny, and on my father's side, it was grandma. But because we lived with my cousins as well and their grandmother came to visit, she was Nana. So we sort of had the full set.
And is there a class variation between that? Are grannies middle class, nanas working class? I mean, that's really crude,
being a feudal society as we still are linguistically, even if we think we're a democracy politically, we do. So I mean, if you go back to mummy, for example, that's a word that most of us would limit or would restrict, in Britain at least, to the use of very small children. But the upper classes retain it. So royalty will refer to mummy even when they're in their 60s. And the nan set, the nan, the nannies, the nanas, those tend to be lower middle class or lower. You don't tend to get... Well, in the aristocracy, you have a nanny, but it's a child's nurse. It's not a related grandma.
And in diverse Britain, there are many of the other terms coming from other languages. I mean, when I was a kid, on one side it was grandma, that was the American side, and then on the other side it was Bubba, the Yiddish for grandmother, Bobby in America. Bubba, which is really a Russian slang word for an old lady, but Bubba came to mean grandmother in
An old
Yiddish.
lady can be very affectionate, can't it?
Yes,
for your wife.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeing in all of this is that in first families, based on what Laura's saying and on Michael's experience as well, in first families too, there's a tremendous amount of linguistic flexibility to describe your relationships to these people because they change over time and they're flexible relationships because there's development. So I love hearing, and the reassurance almost for step families that they're not the only ones who struggle or enjoy the issue of nomenclature and changing it up.
And equally, Wednesday, it changes quite quickly. I mean, this may not seem quick to you because over a person's life, but over the centuries. So Nan, for example, started life as a serving maid. It's just the diminutive form of Anne or Agnes. But of course, because a serving lady could become a child's nursemaid, it got taken over to be a nursemaid.
And nurse could mean breastfeeding, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It could be a very close relationship. It didn't have to be physically related, but yes, you could be a wet nurse or a dry nurse, as they called it. And then nanny isn't known of as a grandmother until 1927.
No.
Which is still living memory, actually.
Because in London schools, I find almost every single child talks about their grandmother as nanny or nana.
Yes.
It's just sort of...
Yes,
it
those
seems to
are
be
our local London
And so it's
schools.
only been around since the 20s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I ought to say that with caution. We can only find it in a written text from 1927. It could have been around for longer. But the chances are that before that it was a just much more generic term for a servant, because in those days we did have servants, or rather you were a servant or you had servants. So it's the narrowing down, as it were, to meaning grandmother that is so very recent. And Nana, similarly, is only known of as a grandmother since 1899. I mean, late Victorian terms in these cases.
I'm wondering about whether there's a change or whether changes are taking place in the language that matches the fact that, say, in a country like Britain, the core of families, what's happening is that people are moving away from each other, so that it's quite rare for maybe 2 or 3 generations or across siblings as they become adults for them all to be living in the same place, and whether that will affect things, and the fact that people don't even know when they're near relatives. I'm thinking here of something that happened in my family. My dad came home and he saw a car parked across his get-out, and there was a note on it saying that the driver would be back in a minute, and it was signed Rechnik. Okay, now my dad knew that there were only about 4 people called Rechnik in the whole of London, and they're all related to him. So anyway, he pops round to the house, which was just a few doors down, and discovered that for several years, and he didn't know it, he'd been living 4 doors down from his cousin's son. And he didn't even know. I mean, he didn't actually have a word for his cousin's son. We don't really, do we? We could start getting into first removes and all the rest of it, but he didn't know. Anyway, there's the thought. So, Dr. Laura Wright and Dr. Wednesday Martin, thank you very much indeed. Goodbye. Thanks for listening. You can find other programmes about language and society at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.